the Cumberland region tomorrow. You're now participating in the forum entitled What's in the Toolbox? Sustaining and expanding on the region's open space and parks. My name is Gary Hawkins. I'll plan to serve today as the moderator, and I'm founding principal of the landscape architecture and planning firm based here in Nashville, Hawkins Partners. Because much of my work over the past 34 years has been in design in the public realm, I am so excited today to be part of the CRT Power of 10 Forum series. I'm also excited about the 4 panelists that will be part of this afternoon's discussion. We'll hear perspectives from Jenny Park, Tennessee State Director of the Trust for Public Land, sharing insights from a national organization that offers its experience on building community partnerships with innovative tools to help generate funding, advance community open space planning and implementation. And then Tim Netsch, Assistant Director of Metro Parks Department, overseeing the planning division. The Metro Parks Planning responsible for 15,873 and counting acres, 185 parks. He can speak to the challenges and opportunities facing a regional system where there are needs to be addressed with finite resources on hand to do so. Tom Turner, President and CEO of the Nashville Downtown Partnership, huge nonprofit advocate for downtown. Tom embodies the slogan, I think, of the live, work, play, and invest in downtown. The partnership realizes the immense value of high quality, activated urban open spaces for all who visit the region, the center of Nashville. And then Jeff Haynes, partner in Boyle Investment Company's Nashville office. He oversees Boyle's significant office and retail development projects in Nashville. He's been part of this leading edge of insightful, developer-driven partnerships for public open space, including recently opened Frankie Pierce Park, adjacent Boyle's Capitol View mixed-use development. Before we begin, let's take a look at our dashboard and its features. On the right side of your screen, you will find the chat and Q&A tabs. Near the end of the broadcast, you'll have our panelists answer questions submitted during the show. If you have an interest in a question already entered, click the upvote button. That will make it rise in popularity. You can view the broadcast in full screen mode by closing the chat and Q&A by clicking on the down arrow in the upper right-hand corner of each feature. You can reopen them if you like to use them later in the broadcast by clicking the chat icon, and all the features will open. So before we go any further, we need to thank our Pinnacle sponsor and all of our sponsors for their support of the Power of 10 and its work in the region. So now, I'd like to open the conversation. Allow me to set the stage briefly for our panelists. Finding creative solutions start by identifying the knowns or givens. Let's consider 3 main givens for today. One is the benefits and value of open space and parkland. I mean, we all feel there is a benefit and value. Increasing demand for the region's recreation and healthy lifestyles is on the rise and will continue to do so. And then finally, we're going to need a bigger toolbox to address this demand. So one of the givens, given number 1, we each intuitively feel the value of having public open spaces in our communities and the benefits of a healthy lifestyle, including being outdoors and regular exercise and play. We're widely documented and supported for their benefits. But beyond the intuitive sense of value, partners and planners, I should say, have devised an accurate way to literally determine the monetary value of parks and greenways in our communities. and Metro's Plan to Play master plan, you can see the staggering financial value of our public parks in this community. And even more focused than ever with COVID-19 pandemic is the value placed on being outside, getting exercise, staying fit, strongly recommended by the Centers for Disease Control. Along these same lines, determining the economic value of open space, CRT commissioned a report by that name, which assessed an even broader spectrum of open spaces across our region. And you can download free the report at the website noted above, the name Economic Value of Open Space in the Cumberland Region. Very detailed report. Look at the numbers. Given number 2, there is and will continue to be increased demand for more open space and parkland across this region. The GNRC in 2020's January month published, boy, that's a long time ago, right? Published a report that projected continued and significant population and job expansion in our region over the next 25 years. And in a similar report from the University of Tennessee, you can see a parallel forecast by county. I know what you're saying to yourself. This was before COVID. But in a recent study, Bloomberg pointed out a significant new trend. Movements from some population centers like the upper Northeast and California, left-hand side, top 10 outbound states, to more appealing states, top 10 inbound states on the right, not unlike Tennessee. Interesting, no? And my final slide, given number 3. Do we have the traditional tools in place, or are they adequate to address these trends? Do we have adequate new tools to protect and plan for sustaining and expanding our open spaces? Hope that's brings some thought to the table. Love to see what our panelists have to say about that. So with that super brief framing of our discussion, I'm excited now to bring on panelists for more of their unique perspectives. Let's begin by leading off this afternoon's discussion with Jenny Park. So she offers insights from the Trust for Public Land, you recall. She's the Tennessee State Director of the Trust for Public Land, where she works with city and philanthropic partners to create parks and protect land for people. So I know there's a standing ovation, Jenny. Welcome to the forum. It's all yours.
Thank you so much, Gary. I'm really excited to be with you all here virtually, and especially excited to be part of this incredible panel. So my name is Jenny Park, and I represent the state of Tennessee for the Trust for Public Land, which is a national nonprofit, and we work in conservation. Our mission is to create parks and protect land for people, ensuring healthy, livable communities for generations to come. And that mission has changed over time in terms of how we operationalize it. Right now, parks, I believe, are more important than ever. And our focus is really to make sure our work is addressing these strategic commitments that speak to how we're building stronger communities. And those commitments are really around health, climate, and equity, with community at the center. And when we talk about parks and open space, I use this kind of simple typology of the different types of parks that I'm speaking about. So one is lands. We think about public lands, maybe a large national park or state park. These are huge assets to our country and part of America's identity. They're also very significant economic generators, especially for rural economies. And one thing that we've seen over the past several months is that our national and state parks have been more used and more loved than ever before. We also look at urban parks, and specifically we want to ensure that anyone who lives in a city can have walkable access to a park. This is especially important for urban neighborhoods that, you know, children and families can walk to a park regardless of whether they have access to a personal vehicle. Another type of green space that is becoming more and more important are schoolyards. And so the Trust for Public Land around the country has done over 200 green schoolyards, turning vacant asphalt areas into these really dynamic, beautiful play spaces that also serve as having green infrastructure benefits, so maintaining stormwater, et cetera. And then the final is trails. And trails is a very broad term that can be anything from a hiking or mountain biking trail to greenways. The trails connect communities, and they're a huge part of our work here in Tennessee. And parks matter now more than ever, especially with the COVID pandemic. You know, there were already health challenges that Tennesseans and Americans are facing, increased social isolation that the pandemic has only exacerbated to a level we never could have imagined. And so these outdoor spaces, whether it's a park or playground or trail, have really become respites from the indoor environments that for some folks are really not ideal environments. And so the outdoors have increasingly become a safe space for people. And one thing that has been highlighted, unfortunately, through the pandemic is that access to these spaces is not equitable across demographics and across neighborhoods. And that goes for Tennessee, it goes for Nashville, it goes for Chattanooga, where I am based out of, and it goes for the country as a whole. This is just one example of an article that has come out during the pandemic that looks at the unequal access to green spaces. There's been a lot of research recently also around the impact of heat islands on cities, especially when thinking through the future climate impacts. You know, cities like Nashville have experienced significant flooding and storm events, and the lack of trees, lack of green infrastructure are challenges that parks can be one part of the solution to address. Planning is such a critical part of ensuring that a city like Nashville and even smaller communities throughout the region have the resources they need to really compete in the future. So a couple of plans that have been really important related to parks is Nashville's master plan, Parks and Greenways master plan, Plan to Play, which you'll be hearing about more momentarily from Tim. And I also wanted to bring attention to a dynamic tool that is accessible to anyone who wants to use it. It's called Climate Smart Cities Nashville. This is a tool that the Trust for Public Land developed to help city leaders and nonprofit organizations and community activists to look at really the context of their city through different lenses, such as issues with increased heat in certain parts of the city, opportunities for green infrastructure, and high impacts for creating new parks. So looking at, for example, the locations, if you put a park there, that could create the park 10-minute walk access to the highest number of people. And so all of these issues around public health, equity, climate resilience can be looked at from the data lens. That's not the whole story, but it's a really great starting point. And these tools are really critical to think through opportunities, especially in an environment of limited resources. This, for example, is a map of the urban heat islands in Davidson County. So you'll notice that the areas in the center of the city that are more developed do have much higher temperatures. And so that is an opportunity for, and really a call for, putting in additional green space to absorb some of that heat. So what are the barriers to getting new parks? So public funding has traditionally really been the source of funding to create parks, build trails, et cetera. And that, I think that members of the public kind of expect that cities and states and federal government will continue to take the lead on that. What we're seeing is that there are some challenges with that, but I want to point out one really significant win, which is federal funding of the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So this year, Congress, through bipartisan support, fully funded the Land and Water Conservation Fund in perpetuity. And what that means is it more than doubled the funding that is going into our country's main source of conservation funding at the federal level. It is also addressing, through $9.5 billion one-time allocation, the nation's National Park Service maintenance backlog, which is huge. This fund is one source for federal dollars, public dollars, to conserve land and to build parks and trails. The majority of it in Tennessee does go toward national and state parks and state-owned lands. However, there are funds for urban parks as well, and these programs are administered through TDEC. And some challenges, along with the great news about the additional federal funding, is that what we're seeing across the country is that COVID has really exacerbated issues with public revenues. And so parks departments, unfortunately, are often some of the first budgets to be cut, especially in the operations and maintenance side. Operations and maintenance are really critical to parks departments and to your experience as a citizen, as a park goer. And they really speak to, I think they impact people's level of pride in their community. When your park is not well kept up, that takes a hit. And so we are seeing budget cuts in city parks departments. We're also seeing reduced local revenues generally for cities, and unless that changes, that's likely that cities will continue to feel uncertain and unwilling to put major capital into parks the way that they may have during a more economic boom. And what that means is that we've got to really be creative with partnerships. And so in addition to really having the expectation that cities should be investing in their parks departments, they are an essential service. They're absolutely vital to the economy and to quality of life for residents. We do know that resources are constrained on the public side. So that's where partnerships come into play. And these are just a few partnerships on the nonprofit and private side. But what I want to share is really that in every park project I've been a part of, whether it is renovating an existing park, building a new multi-million-dollar park, visioning a multi-mile greenway system, all of those require buy-in and partners from diverse backgrounds. And really at the center of it, there's the financial piece of it, but at the center is community buy-in. One thing we hear a lot from particularly our philanthropic partners who are helping to fund projects, is they want to make sure that if they invest in building a park, that people in the community that they're hoping to help raise will actually use the park and feel like it was built for them. And the only way to do that is really to have community members and community-based organizations leading that from the very beginning. And so those community partnerships are absolutely critical. Sorry about that, I apologize. Absolutely critical to continuing to build successful parks that are well-loved and used and are not perceived as coming from outside of their community. A few nonprofit partners who can engage in anything from advocating for parks funding to actually bringing their resources to bear in designing, planning, building a park or community engagement. Land trusts, friends of groups, community-based organizations, and advocates are becoming especially important because of I think the shifting role of community members and leaders in any kind of public infrastructure community design process. Business improvement districts, neighborhood associations, churches, and schools. In Chattanooga, we recently hosted we have a park that needs some activation. It's a bit of a blank slate at this point, and so we're working with a diverse range of partners to get some play equipment into the park. But we also wanted it to be used and viewed really as a resource to the community. We partnered with a local church who held Church in the Park pre-COVID. And it was a wild success and just really fun to see members of the neighborhood really utilizing their park. Foundations, philanthropic institutions, individual donors, corporate partners, and also the real estate industry. These are all really important partners alongside your public partners. And specifically on the real estate industry, you're going to hear more about that in a few minutes, but I wanted to call out a recent study by the Urban Land Institute called The Case for Open Space: Why Real Estate Industry Should Invest in Parks and Open Space. And what I want to point out here is that there really is a spectrum of how you can cities can engage with real estate, the real estate industry. And so Trust for Public Land works with city governments. We facilitate conversations between developers and city governments. And we've done so for many years in Chattanooga. And there are a lot of creative solutions here that can latch on to excitement around new developments, particularly mixed use development, where you want to really encourage public engagement in that space. And then pair that with a vibrant, publicly accessible park space or green space. And finally, I just wanted to reiterate that it really takes all of us. These are unprecedented times, not just with the COVID pandemic, but with all of the different ways that our country is thinking about how we operate. Parks are truly vital to Tennessee and to Nashville, and I'm excited about these different ways of thinking about working together that we're going to hear about in the rest of this forum. So thank you again for having me.
Well, all I can do is say thank you, Jenny. The Trust for Public Land is such a valuable resource for all of Tennessee, for sure, and this region. And we'd love to work more closely with you as we're finding these innovative partnerships that we're going to be talking about more today. Next, let's welcome Tim Netsch, Assistant Director to the Metro Parks, who runs planning. His professional background also includes bike, pedestrian, and trail and historic preservation planning. Tim played a leading role for Metro Parks in the development of Metro Parks and Greenways Master Plan to Play, which was adopted in 2017. And that vital document is intended to offer a full set of tools over the next 10-year planning horizon during an unprecedented time of growth and increased pressures on parks. So welcome to the forum, Tim. Look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you, Gary. And before you mute, you can see my screen, right? You can nod. Okay, thank you. Well, Gary mentioned plan to play, and that is going to be the starting point for my presentation. And I also have to say that Gary was the lead consultant on plan to play, and the Trust for Public Land was also a member of that planning team. Plan to play was a massive undertaking. We had public input from about 18,000 people in Nashville, and it is our comprehensive 10-year playbook for the sustainable growth of Nashville's park system. And to see plan to play and the various things I'm going to present today, just go to plantoplay.nashville.gov. So before we actually got into the content of plan to play, we asked TPL to pull together a value study for parks and greenways in Nashville. Gary said that the value of parks and open space is a given, and I know that all of us presenting today and most of you listening today probably agree with that, but we felt that it would boost our arguments in support of parks and greenways to actually quantify those values. And the study quantified those benefits in several categories. And this is in the appendix of Plan to Play. Feel free to take a look at it. It's a pretty conservative methodology. So if anything, these are probably conservative numbers. But most of them are recurring on an annual basis. So the total additional property value is not one that's recurring on an annual basis, but it is value that goes to property owners who live within proximity of a park. So a greenway or open space park is an amenity that increases surrounding property values, so that $200 million number is actually a benefit to surrounding property owners. That 2 million number is the resulting annual property tax that benefits the city from those higher property values. The stormwater retention value is part of the green infrastructure function of parks. Jenny mentioned urban heat island effect, and stormwater is another one of those benefits from parks and greenways. So this number quantifies the value of all of the pervious surfaces in parks as compared to the mostly impervious surfaces, roofs, concrete, asphalt, parking lots that are in cities outside of parks and open space. Parks capture and treat all of that stormwater and keep it from going into the stormwater system where it would have to be treated with traditional infrastructure. And that number is the cost that would be on the cities that the city would have to pay for in order to treat that stormwater. The air pollution removal value is another one of those green infrastructure functions. So this quantifies the carbon monoxide, the sulfur dioxide, ozone, other chemicals that are absorbed by the tree canopy and other vegetation in parks. In Nashville, probably in most cities, the Parks Department is the single largest owner of the urban tree canopy and its air pollution prevention function. So this number is what it would take for the sources, the industrial sources of this pollution, to capture and keep all of that air pollution from being released into the atmosphere. Tourism value. So you can imagine in Nashville, and I'm sure in your communities, all of the concerts and events and festivals that happen in parks. Most of the big events in downtown Nashville, for example, couldn't happen without using parks as venues. And those tourists spend a lot of dollars outside of the parks in hotels, restaurants, and elsewhere. And then, of course, all of the sports tournaments that parks host. And then in Nashville, we have major tourism destinations like the Parthenon. The recreational use value relates to the private market cost of what the Parks Department provides for free or nearly free throughout our park system. And then the human health value is essentially the value of the preventative effect from the health and wellness benefits of parks. So this totals about $500 million. Again, most of that happening on a recurring basis. Back to Plan to Play overall. Again, it's a very comprehensive project, and it includes recommendations in 5 different categories: land, facilities, programs, operations, and funding. Almost any city master plan includes those first 3 categories. It's a little bit unusual to include operations and funding. We felt it was important to do it in Nashville because of where we were as a park system and as a city. And I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about the funding side of things. What we asked the consulting team to pull together was a menu of funding strategies that the Parks Department and the city of Nashville could potentially implement. What we found is that Nashville is unusually dependent on Metro funding. Clearly, Metro funding is always going to be the largest single source of funding for our park system, as you would expect. But that toolbox that Gary described does not have a lot of tools in it in Nashville from a funding perspective. So we presented these in Plan to Play as, again, a menu of potential strategies to diversify our funding. And I'll go through each of them briefly. With earned income in Nashville, the Parks Department generates about $12 million a year in earned income from golf courses, sports facilities, other revenue producing facilities. All of that goes into Metro's general fund. None of it is retained directly by the Parks Department. That is unusual nationwide. Most cities keep either all or some of their earned income. And keeping some of it directly also introduces some entrepreneurial thinking and entrepreneurial motivation in how we manage facilities. Open space ordinance. This would put some of the burden on the private sector to include open space and parks as conventional private sector development happens, to be sure that those open spaces and parks are integrated as development occurs, rather than the city having to go back and often retroactively try to find the land and the funding to provide those amenities after the fact. And of course, often once the development happens, all of the property values go up, and the barrier to developing those parks is higher than it was before development. Business improvement districts. I'm sure Tom is going to talk about some of the cool things that they're doing in downtown Nashville. certainly a larger percentage of funding from business improvement districts in other cities, in some other cities, is directed toward park projects. And related to this is special tax districts. And in Nashville, Centennial Park might be a good example of a candidate for that. In the areas, in the neighborhoods immediately surrounding Centennial Park, there is a lot of very high-end luxury multifamily housing going in. Almost all of it is branded and marketed using Centennial Park. Centennial Park is a prominent feature in all of their marketing materials, so it is clearly seen as an amenity. It would be reasonable in a case like that, to establish a special tax district where some amount of funding went directly into maintaining the quality of that amenity for those surrounding residences. Sponsorships, with Plan to Play, I begin to think about this in a different way. The way that we would approach it here would be to look at all of our facilities, decide which of them might be candidates for temporary sponsorship or temporary naming, and then essentially go through a competitive process to award those sponsorships. The most prominent example we have in our park system right now is Ascend Amphitheater. And those naming rights go with that building for, I think, another 5 years, 10 years total. And so after that, Nashville and the city can go through a competitive process for sponsorship and naming rights of that facility and derive some additional revenue from it. So this is something that could be considered for other facilities like sports complexes, other revenue producing facilities primarily. Impact development fees, I am by no means an expert on that. My understanding is that impact fees are not permitted in the state of Tennessee, but I know that Nashville does have, for example, a fee in lieu program for sidewalks. I'm not sure how successful that is, but it could be a model for example, integration into an open space ordinance where a private developer is not able to actually incorporate the open space into their project. They might pay into a fund that would allow the city to do it. Enterprise funds, Nashville has used these occasionally in the past as a surcharge at revenue producing facilities to fund a specific improvement. So we might have a surcharge at a golf course, a nominal surcharge at a golf course in order to fund a driving range, for example, so we could expand that program. Parking fees, this would require a bit of a paradigm shift for Nashville. But for example, when big tournaments are happening at some of our sports facilities, people are coming from all over the country to participate in those tournaments and spending a lot of money. Having them pay a nominal fee to park at our facility would not be significant, and it would ease some of the burden on residents to help fund parks. And then we have restaurants and churches and other neighbors to a lot of our parks who routinely use the parks for parking. And we should be deriving some revenue from that. Tax increment financing, many of you are probably familiar with that, so I'll skip over it. That has certainly been used to fund parks in other cities. I don't believe we've ever done it in Nashville. Land and property leases, I will talk about a project that we currently have underway that may incorporate that. And then partners and friends groups. So that is probably the category of funding that is very, very well developed, I would say, in Nashville. Probably the majority of the capital projects that I work on these days are funded through a partnership of some kind. So with that, let me talk about a couple of projects that are in various stages of development in Nashville that involve funding partnerships of some kind. Most of you are probably familiar with Centennial Park. We completed a master plan for Centennial Park several years ago. The images on the top of this slide show the phase 1 project that was completed a few years ago. That was about a $6 million project. The Centennial Park Conservancy funded about $1 million of that budget. The Centennial Park Conservancy is our nonprofit 501c3 Friends organization for Centennial Park. So they funded $1 million. Metro Water Services actually funded about $1.8 million of this project because we daylighted Cockrell Spring, which is shown in this upper center image. All of that water was going directly into the storm sewer system, and we captured it. It's now being used for irrigation and to improve water quality in Lake Watauga. So another green infrastructure function. The lower slides show phase 2, which is currently under construction. That's an $11 million project. $5 million is Conservancy funds. $6 million is Metro funds. We're about to go out to bid on a children's memory garden in Centennial Park. That will be almost entirely funded through the Conservancy, and soon we will begin design on phase 3, which will also be a funding partnership with the Conservancy. Azafran Park, this is immediately adjacent to Conexión Americas, which is another very vibrant nonprofit in Nashville that provides a whole range of services primarily to the New American and immigrant community. So Metro actually funded most of this park, but Conexión Americas did secure pro bono design services and pro bono construction services associated with the actual development of the park. And but the main reason why I'm including them here is because on a daily basis, they are programming this park. They are generating activities in the park. They have a preschool at their adjacent facility. They use the playground. They have farmers markets. They have other festivals and events here. Obviously, COVID has affected all of that, but programming, particularly in these smaller urban pocket parks, is really important. The Parks Department does not have the resources to do it. Often that is the key to success of these spaces, so these program partnerships are really important. Shelby Park. So in Shelby Park, we also have Friends of Shelby Park and Shelby Bottoms. The images here are of the Naval Building, which is listed in the National Register of Historic Places. It's been vacant since 2009. The Parks Department itself does not have a use for this building. Therefore, in order for it to have a useful life, we need to find a tenant or group of tenants to renovate it and to occupy it. So Parks, Friends of Shelby Park, and the Center for Nonprofit Management are currently working on a business plan that would result in just that. So it would likely result in a long-term lease between Metro Parks and Friends of Shelby Park. They would operate and manage the facility. They, with Parks, would agree upon a tenant mix. Hopefully that tenant mix would have some overlap with the mission of the Parks Department. For example, it could be bike and kayak rental that's right on the Cumberland River, special event space, public meeting space, cafe, perhaps office space for area nonprofits. The revenue from leases in the facility would go to Friends of Shelby Park to be used for purposes in Shelby Park agreed upon between Parks and Friends. Cossey Gardner Senior Park. This started out with Metro Water Services. They purchased this urban lot in North Nashville on Jefferson Street and built an underground detention facility on it. And that left a blank slate for the Parks Department to build a park on top of it. We were able to secure Metro funds to cover the design costs, and then the Metropolitan Development and Housing Agency provided about $850,000 in federal funds in order to fund construction of phase 1. The Metro Arts Commission also participated. They funded this wall you can see on the left side of the screen, which will be a mural wall, and they're going to operate a mural program there. So this is really a public partnership. How many P's is that? And then just briefly, one other project I'll mention that I don't have a slide for, but which is very, very excited about, is a partnership with the Oasis Center, which is a Nashville youth Services Organization, SORBA, which is the Southern Off-Road Bicycle Association, and the Nashville Parks Foundation in Watkins Park to build a pump track. So the beauty of that is funding is coming from all kinds of different sources. SORBA has provided pro bono design services, and the kids who are involved in the Oasis Bike Workshop and their mountain bike team are going to commit to long-term maintenance of the facility. So that and a lot of programming there too. So that's one that hits all the bases. So those are some examples of the kinds of partnerships we're doing in Nashville, and then that menu of other options that we hope to continue to work toward making happen. Some of which, by the way, are obviously legislative and would take political leadership. I didn't mention that. But that's what I've got. And I guess back to you, Gary. Thank you.
Tim, that's a lot of good stuff. Thank you. Metro Parks is obviously building on a gigantic legacy, and it's kind of exciting to imagine the future with, even with private funding, public funding becoming an issue. It seems like the partnerships are really being driven to the forefront, and that's exciting as a Nashvilleian. Our next panelist brings a nonprofit perspective. Tom Turner is president and CEO of the Nashville Downtown Partnership. The partnership utilizes financial assessments from property owners in the Central Business Improvement District and the Gulch Business Improvement District of downtown Nashville to implement public space and economic development initiatives. Of those two property owner assessment districts, Tom, I'm sure, has a favorite, but I don't know if we'll get him to tell us which one it is. Tom, always a pleasure to see you. Welcome to the forum. Talk to us about the partnership's perspective on this.
There we go. How about that? All right. I thought we had 50 minutes, but now we have 15. So no, I'm just kidding. I like Plan to Play a lot. There's a ton of work went into it. Obviously Tim and Gary, but a lot of other people. It was a real community plan. So I wanted to lead off with this slide, and you can see that we're below average. So when we look at something like that as in the business that we're in, if we're below average, we want to be above average. So I think if you want more or need more than average, that's understandable, but to expect more at any point in time, especially in these economic times, it's just not realistic. So I want to tell you a little bit about, just from that perspective, these are not pandemic shots. These were taken in the fall of 2018. That's the north end of Riverfront Park. You may see what I see, which is no people. This is the public square. The theme continues. And then this is Walk of Fame Park. There is one pedestrian. You've got to find him. If you work really hard, you'll see him. Again, these were taken the middle of the day in the fall, late summer, early fall of 2018. And so what we found, again, going back to wanting more and needing more, it hasn't been realistic for us downtown. And so we're looking at what happens in other places. And we've done some of this work here in Nashville. And this was in 2018 as well. But we basically took active management and activation and created people. And that's what it takes. And while sometimes people think that we're not respecting all the work that went into it, we realize the budget pressures that are there. And so this is when we found that we put things out that people showed up. And when they were there on a regular basis, people showed up regularly. So very simple things. You can see the ping pong there. What you see, the umbrella where we had ice cream for $1. The funny thing is we gave it away for a few days, and then the state employees got used to it, and then they got mad when it was $1. But that happens sometimes. So we also did, I think, some fun things with activation. That's yoga. We did Tai Chi. We also did Zumba, salsa. I think jumping to the next slide. Well, go to the next one real quick. We also did movies with Christmas Story. We did 4 other movies, I think, and they did quite well. You can see the kids here playing with chalk. What we found was that not just the kids played with chalk, but older people did. I witnessed one 18-year-old acquire a phone number and a date while playing with the chalk. Kid also shares the same address with me, so I know it's real. But a lot of these things are not incredibly difficult. It's really just being there on a regular basis. Tim mentioned it with Casa Azafran and the park there. It's just about putting that information out there. And so jumping back, I showed you pictures of a few parks that we had there. And I'm going to talk about Bryant Park some, but not in great detail. I'm just going to try to give you enough information to make you want to ask questions. When parks are actively managed and activated, the value of property changes. And Tim and Jenny both mentioned this. And so Bryant Park has been around long enough that they're able to compare the values and the increases in the values of property that are near the park or not near the park, and the impact that that's had. So Bryant Park was renovated in '92, so they have 28 years of history. But they have Grace Plaza that faces Bryant Park. It's 1.3 million square feet. Their rent rates are about $15 higher now, being next to Bryant Park, than the buildings that they were neck and neck with 30 years ago. $15 a foot at 1.3 million square feet gets you 19.5 million additional rent dollars per year without changing your expense ratio. And at a cap rate of 6%, that means the building's worth another $325 million. So that's a pretty significant number. And I think that's why there is potential for sponsorships in business improvement districts to work in and around city parks throughout the country. Boom. So just touching a little bit on business improvement districts. Gary mentioned that there are 2 in Nashville. We have managed them since 1999. And a business improvement district exists in Chattanooga, Knoxville, and Memphis. And there's also one in Clarksville, even though I don't believe it's ever been activated. They're not new. They've been around actually 50 years this year. The first one started in Toronto in 1970. But the bids function in a specific geographic area, and they property owners form the bid to provide supplemental services for which they pay. And it's very simple. Those supplemental services are managed typically by a nonprofit, and the supplemental services are determined by the property owners. So they may determine that there's a lack of cleanliness, or there's a lack of events in certain areas. And I think that's just pure supply and demand. And property owners, we found, have been willing to pay for services where they see a direct correlation to what they pay and what they receive. So to expect this to happen on any kind of a general tax structure is probably not realistic. And so that's just the general basics of business improvement districts. Happy to talk to you about that more. I'll say for when you're looking at parks, you could be talking about beautification activation, other things. Even in parks we've seen in other cities, restrooms, cafes, concessions, a number of different things that can really change the overall behavior of parks. The other thing I wanted to mention about Bryant Park, well, two other things actually. It's next to the public library in Midtown Manhattan. It's about just under 10 acres. And the annual budget for the Bryant Park Corporation, which operates the park, annual budget's $22 million. That's a pretty healthy budget. The bid provides 7%. The other 93% comes from concessions, events, and sponsorships. The interesting thing there is you have something called the Bank of America Winter Village. It provides $3 million in net revenue to the park. And so other things that happen in the park, you have Coca-Cola ping pong tables. Coca-Cola is written very small. You have the Southwest Porch, which is actually on the southwest corner of the park, and it's for Southwest Airlines. And you have Health Magazine Yoga. And I think if you walk by there, you'll see that the integrity of the park hasn't changed dramatically. So when we're talking about sponsorships, they can be a significant source of revenue for parks management, supplemental services. Of course, they have to be thoughtful, and you have to be strategic enough to ensure that you don't compromise the character of the park. And if the park is there as an asset for the community, I think those things can be worked through. So what I've really covered is some parks that we have in downtown Nashville, some things that we learned while activating, and some potential ways to fund that activation. And as an example, right now, it's not just limited to New York and Bryant Park or Salesforce in San Francisco. You have Tulsa, Oklahoma City, Greensboro. The list goes on of other cities that are doing very similar things. And so it goes back to the basic premise: to want more and need more is certainly understandable. To expect more is just not realistic. And so I think there's a great future in Nashville and the surrounding community to leverage improvement districts and sponsorships to enhance the public parks experience. And I will close and tell you that I did it in 11 minutes and 30 seconds.
I am amazed. No, not really. Tom, good stuff. Obviously, activation of our park spaces takes somebody thinking about it every day, and that's a super place for partnerships to happen. So thank you for all that. And I know you've probably generated some questions from our listeners. Batting cleanup in this big rotation is Jeff Haynes, partner in Boyle Investment Company's Nashville office. Distinguished developer by profession, Jeff has an added perspective, being a member of the Metro Board of Parks and Recreation and Nashville Planning Commission. So developer and guru of kind of all things. We appreciate you participating in today's forum, and you can take it away, and we'll get back to the group in just a few minutes.
Great, Gary. Thank you so much for having me. Let me see if I can get to the start of the presentation. Sorry about that. So my name is Jeff Haynes. Thanks again for having me. I'm here today to talk about the importance of public-private partnerships and long-term planning for parks departments in cities around the region. Specifically to talk about our project Capitol View. For those of you outside Nashville, this sits at the base of the state capitol along Interstate 40 and along Charlotte Avenue. And this was an industrial wasteland of 35 acres. This picture was taken in 2012. The area highlighted in green will be the focal point of the presentation as we go through this. In 2011, Northwestern Mutual, the landowner, approached us to assist them with long-term land planning. We chased many ideas down the rabbit hole, including IKEA, the new baseball stadium, which looked here temporarily, and lots of other uses. And about that time, we were very lucky to land HCA, who brought in 2,000 jobs, really to accelerate intense land planning. When we started the process, no idea of parks or greenways was considered. And that was probably our mistake. Throughout the land planning, we did identify coal ash throughout the project, and then decided to work very closely with the Department of Environment and Conservation here in Nashville, and entered into a voluntary brownfield agreement for the entire 35 acres, and we're very proud of that. About the time that happened, the then Mayor Carl Dean approached us in 2013 with a naive idea to extend the Gulch Greenway, which stopped at the south side of Charlotte Avenue. And we naively said, yes, how hard can it be to extend a greenway? That started a 4-year battle with CSX Railroad to buy 3 small parcels from the railroad to make the greenway a reality. In 2015, Shane Dennison approached us with the idea that the city had identified the North Gulch as being a green space desert, and they wanted to put a 1-acre pocket park where you see the urban park on the slide here. So we started working closely with Shane and Tim at Parks on the concept of the city buying 1.26 acres from Boyle and Northwestern Mutual at a very deep discount to create that pocket park. Throughout the planning process, the Parks Department became convinced that a larger 2.5-acre park with active uses would be much better, and approached us about the idea of giving the city an additional 1.25 acres to combine with the 1.2 acres they would buy from us. And after long, hard discussions internally, we felt like the 2.5-acre urban park and the greenway connection to our project would be well worth a public-private partnership. So we spent about a year negotiating with the city to create that public-private partnership. It was a little bit tricky, but well worth the effort. Here is the greenway extended through our park, or through our project, connecting into Frankie Pierce Park. Here is Frankie Pierce Park. And what we're especially proud of is the intentionality that Parks had in coming up with the active uses designed in 2.5 acres. And here's an aerial of that. And you can see we have beach volleyball courts, children's play equipment, exercise equipment, a very large, spacious dog park, as well as the greenway trails running through the park. Here's the children's play equipment. The slides over the historic cobblestones, which we found underneath the streets in Joe Johnston, which we salvaged. So even in a 2.5-acre urban park, you can intensely plan the uses to create a very special place. Finally, in the last 60 days, we have completed art murals on the CSX bridge abutments. These were done in time for August 18th here to commemorate the 100th centennial celebration to the 19th Amendment. Frankie Pierce, for whom the park is named, was a very active suffragist and played a critical role in winning the right to vote for the state of Tennessee. So at the end of the project, which opened in the fall of 2019, the statistics include the city purchasing 1.26 acres, as I mentioned, at a deeply discounted price. The developer, Boyle and Northwestern, contributed 1.5 acres. The city ended up spending $3.5 million in total, including land acquisitions. And through neighbor and stakeholder contributions and donations, the private side spent almost $2 million for a total cost of $5.5 million. I would tell you that 1 year later, the park and greenway have far exceeded the expectations of not only we as the developer, but all of the stakeholders in the area, including the neighborhoods who use this park extensively. While the public-private partnership was tricky, especially for developers, it was well worth the effort. And as long-term owners of our projects, the sense of community created at Capitol View relies heavily on the public spaces and the park and the greenway. So with that, I will turn it back to Gary. Mine was the shortest on purpose.
Well, thank you, Jeff. What a terrific example of a not a simple park development for Metro Nashville. That took some perseverance, and I'm so happy that it's paid out for everyone. It's a beautiful, what would have been a remnant piece of land that would have never seen much light of day. It's turned into a vibrant asset for the community. So thank you for that, and thank you to all the panelists for I think some very detailed insights into what this community is doing and what other communities are bringing to the table for potential partnerships. Because I think those givens that we began our presentations about 30 minutes ago or so, phenomenal to see that we're managing now to find partnerships in creative, innovative ways. I'm just curious, before we get into Q&A with others, have you heard anything from other panelists that you'd like to comment on, or had an insight because of what was said as we're pulling our questions together from those that are listening in? Me just curious to open it up. If you want to raise your hand and unmute your mic, if you have any insight or hadn't thought about how successful that could be for my community, or anything else before we get into Q&A. Okay, let's move into Q&A. Well, we've had a couple of questions pop up, and I would like to share those. This one's for Jenny, I think, since it's talking about, Eric asked, how do we get Nashville schools to commit to outdoor classrooms, like you mentioned in the presentation from Chattanooga?
Great question. Working with schools is different than even working with city governments. There are a lot of concerns and some hand-holding that you may need to go through in order to give schools confidence in terms of how the amenities will be used, who is funding it, et cetera. I would say that approaching schools, one good strategy to start with is really working through the PTA or a parent group, starting with the leadership within the school first. And, helping find resources that gives the school confidence that if a classroom is installed, or if the image I showed was of a green schoolyard that is essentially a really vibrant play area that can be used for learning and can be used just for play. And there's a combination of funding and working with administrators, and I think starting from more of a grassroots position of making sure that the parents really want this and the students want it, and then having examples of how it has worked well other places. That is one area in which Trust for Public Land can help, because we've done this around the country. I do think that schools are increasingly important places to really give interactive opportunities for kids to play, especially as we've been indoors so much lately.
Next question is a kind of a two-parter. I think that might be for Tim. So what's the status of implementation of all the recommendations in Plan to Play, the 10-year vision? And secondarily, what initiatives or funding strategies do you see next as some low-hanging fruit for partnerships like you've seen success with so far in Metro? Is that two parts?
Yeah, but I may need to be reminded what the second part is after I answer the first part. Since Plan to Play was finished, Nashville, well, the entire world, the entire country, but Nashville in particular has been in a very tumultuous period. We've had 3 mayors, financial crisis, and then tornado, COVID, everything else. So I would say that we are not where we should be 3 years in on Plan to Play. And Nashville's financial situation in particular makes it that much more important that we seize this time and this opportunity to diversify our revenue streams and explore some of those other strategies that have been mentioned. What I didn't mention is that some of those various alternate funding sources are the same sources that lots of other perhaps non-traditional recipients of those funds are also looking at. For example, for public art and things like that. So it's not unique to identify bid funding or TIF funds to fund to try to secure those for whatever interest a person may have. But so I think now is the good time to look at diversifying those funding streams. And then the second part is what's next? Which of those come next? Is that right, Gary?
Well, it could be using your crystal ball. What would be the low-hanging fruit funding to augment public funds based on the recommendations that were made in Plan to Play? Was that be fair?
Sure. One positive recent development is the creation of the Nashville Parks Foundation. We have more than a dozen different nonprofit friends groups that are sanctioned by the park board. Each of them either has a specific park that they're interested in, or a specific program or park type. For example, Friends of Metro Dance, or Greenways for Nashville, which is countywide but focused on greenway trails. So the Nashville Parks Foundation is our first partner with a focus as broad as that of the Parks Department itself. So they have a relatively new executive director. She's working hard to get various programs up and running. Of course, fundraising for all kinds of nonprofits has been made much more difficult by COVID. On the other hand, the value of parks and open spaces has really become so much more obvious since COVID has happened. We've seen an incredible growth in the use of trails and other park facilities in our system. So I think people value them more than ever. And as I said, one thing I will say since 2017 is the percentage of our projects that are a partnership of some kind have only increased. nonprofit groups and other partners are, it's becoming more clear than ever that collaborating is the way to get some of these things done. So that's why in the past, there may have been a project that had one partner, and these days we've got these projects with 4 and 5 different partners involved. And for some of the stuff that would involve legislation, I think because of the various crises in Nashville, some of our elected officials who are very, very strong parks proponents have had crises to manage. So hopefully, as some of these crises settle down, new attention can be given to some of these longer term parks and open space issues.
Sarah asked, any suggestions for smaller, more rural towns with limited funds for hiring professionals who can help plan future green spaces? Where can smaller towns and communities find resources? Jenny, maybe, does that sound like something you could take?
Sure. Well, first of all, feel free to get in touch with me offline, and maybe we could chat and I can direct you more specifically. But there are a number of resources out there. One thing to really look at now is the TDEC has several funding opportunities related to parks and recreation projects. And so they have a grant cycle that has just opened. And so they have actual federal and state funds that are available to apply for. I'd be happy to chat with you on what you're thinking. But funding is often a significant barrier for smaller communities. In some regions, there are nonprofits who also provide some technical assistance or resources to help shepherd you. Another thing to just be aware of is the Land and Water Conservation Fund that I mentioned does have significant money that will be coming to states to be available to communities. And within that, there is often the ability to actually hire professional services as part of the project. And so if often there are projects or ideas that have been spun around for years, and maybe you haven't been able to get a master plan in place for it, but I would encourage you to look into some of the funding opportunities out there to make that happen. Another thing I just want to mention, for whether you're a smaller community or Nashville, we don't know yet if there will be a stimulus package specifically for infrastructure. We saw that in 2008, 2009 with ARA. There was a lot of money from the federal government made available to cities. And the emphasis at that time was on shovel-ready projects. And so looking back, we saw that what cities applied for was not necessarily their most strategic projects. It was kind of what they were ready to do. And so be thinking now, we don't know if that will happen, but be thinking now about, what are the parks and green space projects that could really catalyze your community, and try to get plan in place for it now, so that you can really leverage those public funds should they come down the pipe.
Thank you. We always think about our main streets and our downtowns being the hardest places to actually create these places for humans because it's all built out. So the next question is really, it may be Tom, but it may also be Jeff. For communities that have main streets or downtowns, and certainly downtown Nashville is kind of a larger version of all that. What's the hardest thing about getting a park, building a park, or securing a park for where the population density is built up? So Tom, you want to start that? Maybe mostly downtown for you, but Jeff, I know you work in many communities. So where there's density, where the parks are needed, what's the most difficult part about that?
I think obviously identifying the land and acquiring it, are the two obvious things. I think looking at even parks downtown and what's actively used and not actively used. By the end of next year, we will have 3 new parks. We have Frankie Pierce that just opened in 19. We have Noble Park, which opened on Saturday. It's a private park in the Gulch, but it is green space. And then Nashville Yards is designing a great space, and basically similar to Frankie Pierce as far as activation. So we have parks along the river, we have parks along the railroad tracks, we have one in the middle at Walk of Fame, and we have Bicentennial Capitol Mall. I think what we're really looking at is how do we actively manage what we have in creating those as active green spaces. And I think we'll find that when we're doing that, the demand for park space won't seem quite as high. We have 15,000 people downtown, and we have 6 parks. And of course, we have 15 million visitors. You can't discount those, and 2 million regional residents. But our park space, it's better than a lot of people give it credit for, I think. They just happen to look at the parks differently because of what happens there or necessarily doesn't happen there. And Jeff can probably speak to the real difficulties of acquiring the land and developing a park far more than I can.
Yeah, Gary, great question. I think it really requires a change in thought process first. And we develop all over Middle Tennessee, all over West Tennessee, and it can be a third of an acre, it can be a fourth of an acre, and integrating green space into your land plans when you're doing new projects, it just requires a different thought process. Sometimes you don't have to go out and acquire the land. You just have to have folks like Tim or you or other good land planners who will challenge you to think differently about your project. We just opened a new project here in Cool Springs where we've got 2 retail jewel boxes surrounding a green space that's maybe 1/8 of an acre. And yet we've got a Jenny's ice cream on one end and a wine bar on the other. And it's hugely popular now with all the young families in Cool Springs. We never thought it would be the case. So I think it really requires a change in thought process first.
Thank you for that. Let's see. Here is a question from Greg. Has Davidson County or other counties in the region considered a ballot bond for funding parks and open space? And I'll open that up to whoever has any insight into that.
I don't have any particular insight, but I'll give it a shot because nobody else unmuted. I know that when we were doing Plan to Play with a previous mayor, when we were discussing the draft of the plan and going through the major recommendations, we were actually hesitant to include that on the menu of funding strategies. You'll notice it wasn't one of the bulleted items on that slide. And it was actually one of the key people in the mayor's office who brought up the subject. So it is a matter of political appetite and advocacy on the part of the people who want to make it happen. But ultimately, it's the elected officials who, need to decide that something like that should activists and, well, in that case, I guess not necessarily the elected officials, but it's been discussed. I don't know how seriously it's ever been discussed in Nashville.
And I'll quickly add to that TPL has been involved with many ballot initiatives, and yes, there does need to be a strong advocacy and a population who's ready to move that forward. You can do a feasibility study as a way to gauge interest and what might be possible. But I will say that these have passed in rural places, urban, conservative, liberal. They have passed all over the country, including in our neighbor, Georgia, recently.
So another question, Jenny, this you might be a follow-up on this one. Who initiates typically private partnerships with the community? So we're learning that the private sector is partnering more and more creatively with the public sector. TPL is probably seeing a pretty wide array of that happening. Is there a tendency now that it's happening from the public side reaching out, or the private side reaching to the public with the need for parks? Can you tell us a little bit more about what you know about
Sure,
that?
I can share my experience in the 3 years that I've been at TPL and 3 years that I worked for city government. I often actually found the outreach coming from the private side. And, you know, I'm not a real estate development professional, but I do know that there are a lot of benefits to having green space. And sometimes if you've got a willing public partner, maybe there are some compromises and there are some opportunities that together you can make a really great park work that benefits the community and the development over the long term. And so that's really the ideal scenario. I'm seeing more and more interest from the private side in terms of wanting to, for example, connect a development into an existing park, and how can we make that happen? Possibly donation of land to expand a park, because that will be beneficial to the whole community and to the development. And then I also have I get a lot of interest from philanthropic partners who are working in a geographic specific area, and they see opportunities for parks and want our insight or want to know if we have partners we can bring to the table to make something larger happen with that coalition of people they're already working with. So I hope that answers the question.
All right, we have just a couple minutes left. Great questions. Thank you, audience. What are the top 3 things people who care about parks and open space can do to support them in the region? That's a nice, big, broad topic, but quick popcorn kind of answers. Any thoughts? What are the top 3 things?
I would say make sure your elected officials, especially your local ones, know that you care about parks and green space, including operations and maintenance. That's one thing.
Vote.
That's a good one. I like that. Vote. Yes. I think having a plan of action, from my perspective, community participation has been really valuable for Metro in developing a plan and a strategy. So continuing not to think about that as a document on a shelf, but there are ideas in there that can be implemented for every part of this community. And so having a plan, not just letting growth happen to you, but I think it's an important aspect of managing and protecting those spaces that are really important. You got to have a plan. Other thoughts as we wind down?
Support organizations working to promote and take care of outdoor spaces. There are a lot of grassroots organizations too, working in community gardens or activating parks in underrepresented areas. So think about what you support and put your money where your mouth is.
Yes. Well, with that, putting our money where our mouth is, thank you so much for Pinnacle and all of our sponsors who are supporting the efforts of the Cumberland region tomorrow, and particularly these forum. There will be 3 more of these coming up soon. go to the Cumberland Region Tomorrow's website. You'll see the next in the series. Very informative, interesting panels, all about this community, which we care about and love. So I hope you will continue to support Cumberland Region Tomorrow and tune in the next time when the next one in the series is coming right up. Thank you again, panelists. Great job. Enjoyed being with you today virtually. We'll do this again sometime when we can all be sitting around a table, okay?
Thank you, Gary, for hosting.
Thank you all.